The metallic clang of bolt cutters echoed through this silent storage facility on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon. It was 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in late November, and frost covered the ground like a thin blanket of broken glass. 2 figures worked quickly under the dim security light, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. They had chosen Unit 217 carefully. The lock looked old, rusted. The rent sticker showed it was 2 months overdue. Easy pickings, they thought. What they didn't know was that someone was living inside. Marcus Chen and his younger brother Danny had been hitting storage units for 6 months now, ever since Marcus lost his job at the lumber mill and Danny's construction work dried up for the winter. They told themselves it wasn't really stealing. These units were abandoned, the owners had stopped paying. The stuff inside would end up in auction anyway. They were just getting there first. The bolt cutters made short work of the lock, and as the metal door rolled upward with a grinding screech, they expected to find the usual forgotten treasures. Old furniture, boxes of clothes, maybe some tools they could sell at the pawn shop downtown. Instead, they found a man. If you're enjoying this story and want to hear more incredible tales like this one, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It really helps us continue bringing you these powerful stories. Now, let's continue. He was sitting on a folding chair in the back corner of the 10x10 space, wrapped in layers of blankets and coats. His eyes reflected the beam from Marcus's flashlight like those of a startled animal. For a long moment, nobody moved. The homeless man was older, maybe in his 60s, with a gray beard that reached his chest and weathered skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. Around him, the storage unit was organized with surprising precision. Plastic bins were stacked neatly against one wall. A camping stove sat on a small table. Books were arranged on makeshift shelves made from wooden crates. A sleeping bag lay rolled up on a thin mattress on the floor. Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't supposed to happen. They had watched the facility for weeks, noting which units showed signs of abandonment. Never once had they considered that someone might actually be living in one. Danny stood frozen beside him, the bolt cutters still in his hands. The homeless man slowly stood up, his movements careful, non-threatening. He was tall but thin, his frame lost inside all those layers of clothing. When he spoke, his voice was surprisingly calm, almost gentle. "Can I help you boys with something?" The question hung in the cold air. Marcus and Danny exchanged glances. They could run. They probably should run. But something kept them rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the complete lack of fear in the old man's eyes. Maybe it was the unexpected dignity in his posture. Or maybe it was the simple humanity of the moment, the recognition that they had just violated not just a storage space, but someone's home. "We thought it was empty," Marcus finally managed to say. His voice sounded weak, even to his own ears. "The lock was overdue. We didn't know anyone was in here." The old man nodded slowly, as if this explanation made perfect sense. His name was Thomas Reeves, though Marcus and Danny wouldn't learn that until later. What they learned in that moment was that Thomas wasn't going to call the police. He wasn't going to shout or threaten. Instead, he did something that would change all 3 of their lives. He invited them in. "It's cold out there," Thomas said, gesturing to the space beside his chair. "I've got coffee on the stove. Not great coffee, but it's hot." Marcus and Danny should have left. Every instinct told them to get out of there before security showed up or before this strange situation turned dangerous. But there was something about Thomas, something in his calm acceptance of the situation, that made them stay. Danny set down the bolt cutters. Marcus pulled the storage unit door closed behind them, leaving just enough gap for air. And then they sat down on plastic bins across from this man whose home they had just broken into and accepted paper cups of instant coffee heated on a single-burner camping stove. The coffee was terrible, weak and bitter, but Marcus wrapped his hands around the cup and felt grateful for the warmth. The unit was surprisingly warm, too. Thomas had rigged up a small propane heater, the kind designed for camping, which he ran sparingly to conserve fuel. The space smelled of coffee and old books and something else, something Marcus couldn't quite place. Hope, maybe, or survival. Thomas sat back down in his folding chair and looked at them with eyes that had seen too much, but somehow hadn't lost their kindness. "So, what's your story?" Thomas asked. "You boys don't look like career criminals." Marcus felt shame wash over him like a wave. He thought about lying, making up some excuse, but found he couldn't. There was something about Thomas's presence that demanded honesty. So Marcus told him everything. About losing his job when the mill closed, about his wife leaving and taking their daughter to Seattle, about the bills piling up in the apartment he couldn't afford anymore, about Danny dropping out of community college to help him make rent, and then both of them ending up in Marcus's beat-up truck, sleeping in Walmart parking lots and wondering how their lives had fallen apart so fast. Danny added his own details. How he had tried to find work, any work but with no degree and no experience. Doors kept closing in his face. How they had started with small things, collecting cans for recycling money, doing odd jobs under the table. How one desperate night they had seen a storage unit auction advertised online and gotten the idea that maybe they could cut out the middleman. How tonight was supposed to be their big score, enough money to get a real apartment to start over. Thomas listened without interrupting, his weathered face showing no judgment. When they finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if it held answers. Outside, they could hear the wind picking up, rattling the metal door. Inside, the little heater hummed softly, fighting against the November cold. "I know something about losing everything," Thomas finally said. "Would you like to hear my story?" Marcus and Danny nodded. There was nowhere else to be, nothing else to do. And somehow, sitting in this 10 by 10 space with a man whose home they had tried to rob, they wanted to know. They needed to know. Thomas set down his coffee cup and began to speak. 20 years ago, I was a professor of literature at Reed College. I had a beautiful wife named Catherine, 2 sons in high school, house in the West Hills with a view of Mount Hood. I had tenure, respect, a retirement account. I had a life that made sense. Then Catherine got sick. His voice didn't waver as he told them about the cancer diagnosis, about how quickly it spread, about the experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover, about maxing out credit cards and taking out a second mortgage and doing everything he could to save her, about how she died anyway, in a hospice room on a gray afternoon in March, with spring flowers blooming outside the window and Thomas holding her hand. "I thought I could handle it," Thomas continued. "I went back to work after the funeral, kept teaching my classes, grading papers, pretending everything was fine. But something inside me had broken. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. My sons were dealing with their own grief, and I couldn't help them because I couldn't even help myself. I started drinking. Not a lot at first, just enough to make it through the evenings. Then it was enough to make it through the afternoons, then the mornings." He told them about losing his job, about his sons moving away to live with Catherine's sister, about the house going into foreclosure, about waking up one day in a shelter and realizing he had become invisible. People looked through him on the street. Former colleagues crossed the road to avoid him. The descent from respected professor to homeless man had taken less than 3 years. "But here's the thing," Thomas said, leaning forward slightly, his eyes intense in the dim light. "Being invisible taught me to see. When you're homeless, you notice things other people don't. You see the people who go out of their way to help and the ones who go out of their way to ignore. You learn who you really are when everything else is stripped away. And eventually, if you're lucky, you find your way back to something resembling hope." Thomas explained that he had been sober for 4 years now. He attended meetings at a church downtown 3 times a week. He had reconnected with his sons, though their relationships were still healing. He worked part-time at a bookstore under the table for cash. It wasn't enough for an apartment, not in Portland's rental market, but it was enough to pay for this storage unit. Enough to have a space that was his, a door he could close, a place to keep warm and dry. "It's not much," Thomas said, gesturing around the small space, "but it's mine. I've got my books, my little stove, a roof that doesn't leak. Some nights I even feel grateful. The world looks different when you've lost everything and found yourself still standing." Marcus felt something shift inside him as he listened. Here was a man who had fallen further than Marcus could imagine, and yet there was no bitterness in his voice, no anger at the world that had let him fall. Just a quiet strength, a determined dignity. Danny seemed equally affected. His young face, usually hardened by months of struggle, had softened. His eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Why are you telling us this?" Danny asked quietly. Thomas smiled for the first time, and it transformed his weathered face. "Because you boys broke into my home tonight, and you could have hurt me, taken my things, made a bad situation worse. But you didn't. You stayed. You listened. You shared your coffee with a stranger. That tells me something about who you are. And I think you need to hear that right now. Things might be hard, but they don't define you. How you respond to hardship, that's what matters." They talked for another hour. Thomas told them about resources in the city they didn't know existed. A day labor agency that paid fair wages and asked no questions. A community center that offered free job training. A landlord he knew who rented rooms by the week, no credit check required. He wrote down names and addresses on scraps of paper, his handwriting still elegant, despite everything, the professor's penmanship not quite forgotten. As dawn began to lighten the sky outside, Marcus and Danny prepared to leave. But before they did, Marcus did something he would remember for the rest of his life. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the $63 he had been saving for gas money. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He held it out to Thomas. "For the lock," Marcus said, "and the coffee." Thomas looked at the money for a long moment, then up at Marcus's face. "I don't need your money, son, but I appreciate the gesture. Tell you what, take that money and use it to get yourself some breakfast. Both of you. And then go to that day labor place I told you about. Show up early, work hard, and keep showing up. That's the best way to repay me." But the lock, Danny protested. We broke your lock. Thomas waved a hand dismissively. I've got another one. Been meaning to change it anyway. Consider it a gift. Consider this whole night a gift. Sometimes the universe puts people in each other's paths for a reason. Maybe I needed to remember that my story matters, that I can still help someone. And maybe you boys needed to meet someone who's been where you are and made it through. They left as the sun rose over Portland, painting the storage facility in shades of gold and pink. Marcus and Danny walked to the truck in silence, each processing what had just happened. The bolt cutters lay forgotten on the ground outside Unit 217. They didn't need them anymore. Wouldn't need them again? The drive back through the awakening city felt different somehow. Marcus watched people hurrying to work, carrying coffee cups and briefcases, living their normal lives. Yesterday, he had looked at these people with resentment, with envy. Today, he just felt tired and strangely hopeful. Beside him, Danny stared out the window, lost in his own thoughts. Neither spoke until they reached the Walmart parking lot, where they had been sleeping in the truck for the past 3 weeks. We can't go back to that, Danny said quietly as Marcus pulled into their usual spot in the far corner of the lot. Breaking into storage units. Even if we're desperate again, we just can't. Marcus nodded. His hands were still shaking slightly, though whether from cold or from the emotional intensity of the night, he couldn't say. I know. We won't. Thomas trusted us when he had no reason to. We owe him better than that. We owe ourselves better than that. They tried to sleep for a few hours, curled up in the truck cab with their jackets as blankets, but real rest wouldn't come. Marcus kept seeing Thomas's face, that calm acceptance, that complete lack of judgment. He kept thinking about everything the older man had lost and how he had somehow transformed that loss into something like wisdom. When 8 o'clock arrived, Marcus was already awake, watching the morning shoppers arrive at the Walmart, families with children, elderly couples, teenagers heading to school nearby. Danny stirred and sat up, rubbing his eyes. You ready to do this? To go to that day labor place Thomas mentioned? Marcus thought about it. His pride wanted to say no. Day labor was for people who couldn't get real jobs, for people at the bottom. But then he remembered that he was at the bottom. Had been for months now. The only question was whether he would stay there or start climbing back up. Yeah, I'm ready. Let's go get that breakfast Thomas talked about. Then we'll head over there. They found a diner downtown, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and waitresses who had been working there for decades. Marcus ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, 2 eggs and toast, but the waitress took one look at them and brought over extra bacon and hash browns without being asked. Sometimes people could see when you needed a break. Sometimes kindness came from unexpected places. As they ate, Marcus found himself telling Danny more about the conversation with their ex-wives and estranged family members, about all the bridges they had burned. Danny listened quietly, methodically working through his food. And when Marcus finished, Danny set down his fork and looked at his older brother with an intensity that was rare for him. You know what Thomas showed us last night? That it's never too late. That man fell all the way down and he's coming back. We haven't fallen as far as he did. We've still got time to fix this. All of it. Marcus wanted to believe that. Part of him did believe it, but another part, the part that had been beaten down by months of failure and rejection, whispered that they were different. That Thomas was exceptional, educated, strong. That Marcus and Danny were just 2 guys who had screwed up their lives and would keep screwing up no matter what they tried. But he didn't say any of that to Danny. Instead, he finished his breakfast, left a generous tip from their dwindling cash supply, and drove to the address Thomas had given them. The day labor agency was in a converted warehouse in an industrial area southeast of downtown. A dozen men were already waiting when Marcus and Danny arrived, sitting on benches outside or leaning against the building, smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee from thermoses. They looked weathered, tired, most of them older than Marcus. This was the invisible workforce of the city, the people who loaded trucks and cleaned buildings and did the jobs nobody else wanted. Marcus had never imagined himself among them. Now he was grateful for the chance to try. The dispatcher was a heavy-set woman named Gloria who looked them over with shrewd eyes when they approached her desk. First time? Yes, ma'am, Marcus said. We're looking for any work you've got. Gloria studied them for another moment, then nodded. You look strong enough. We've got a loading job at a distribution center, 10 hours, $15 an hour cash at the end of the shift. You break anything, you pay for it. You don't show up on time, don't bother coming back. Clear? Crystal clear, Danny said quickly. When do we start? Van leaves in 10 minutes. You're in the back. The work was brutal. Marcus and Danny spent 10 hours loading and unloading trucks at a massive distribution center, moving boxes of electronics and furniture and appliances. The warehouse was cold despite the number of bodies moving through it, and the work was relentless. Every time they finished one truck, another backed up to the loading dock. The regular workers barely acknowledged them, and the supervisor barked orders without bothering to learn their names. Marcus's back was screaming by lunchtime. His hands were blistered by mid-afternoon. Beside him, Danny was clearly struggling too, his young face pale with exhaustion. But neither complained. They had been given a chance, and they were going to see it through. When the shift finally ended, and Gloria handed them each $150 in cash, Marcus felt a surge of pride that surprised him. It wasn't much money. He had earned more than that in a few hours at his old mill job. But this felt different. This felt earned in a way nothing had in a long time. "You boys did good today," Gloria said, counting out the bills. "You want to come back tomorrow?" "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said immediately. "What time?" "Same time, and bring gloves if you've got them. Your hands look like hamburger." They drove back to the Walmart parking lot in silence, both too exhausted to speak. That night they ate fast food in the truck cab and fell asleep before the sun fully set, their bodies demanding rest after the physical punishment of the day. Marcus dreamed of the storage unit, of Thomas sitting in his folding chair surrounded by his carefully organized life. In the dream, Thomas was teaching a class, and Marcus was one of the students, trying to write down everything the old professor said before he forgot it. The next morning they were back at the day labor agency, and the morning after that. By the end of the first week, they had earned $750 each. It wasn't enough for an apartment, not in Portland's expensive rental market, but it was more money than they had seen in months. More importantly, it was a routine, a purpose, a reason to get up in the morning besides desperation. On Friday evening, after they cashed their week's earnings, Marcus suggested they stop by the storage facility to check on Thomas. They found Unit 217 easily, the new lock gleaming in the evening light. Marcus knocked on the metal door, feeling strange about knocking on a storage unit like it was a house. After a moment, they heard movement inside, and then the door rolled up. Thomas stood there in the same layers of clothing, but his face lit up when he saw them. "Boys, come in, come in. I was just making dinner." The unit looked exactly as it had a week ago, neat and organized, the small space maximized for efficiency. But something felt different, warmer somehow. Or maybe it was just that Marcus saw it differently now, not as a sad place where a homeless man lived, but as a home. A real home, created with care and maintained with dignity despite impossible circumstances. Thomas heated up soup on his camping stove, some kind of vegetable mixture he had made at the community center's kitchen. He served it in chipped bowls with plastic spoons, apologizing for not having proper dishes. Marcus and Danny assured him it was perfect, and it was. They sat on the plastic bins on the floor, eating soup and talking about their week. Marcus told Thomas about the day labor work, about Gloria and the distribution center and how much his body hurt. "That's honest work," Thomas said approvingly. "Hard work, but honest. You're building something even if you can't see it yet. You're building discipline, reliability, a reputation. Those things matter more than people think." Danny asked Thomas about his week, and the older man told them about his job at the bookstore, about the regular customers he was starting to recognize, about the simple pleasure of being around books again after years away. He talked about a meeting he had attended where he celebrated 4 years of sobriety, about how strange it felt to stand up and receive a chip in front of a room full of people who understood the journey. "You should come sometime," Thomas said, "to a meeting. You don't have to be an addict to attend. They have open meetings. It might help, hearing other people's stories of hitting bottom and climbing back." Marcus considered it. He had never thought of himself as someone who needed that kind of support. But then again, he had never thought of himself as someone who would sleep in his truck and break into storage units either. Maybe it was time to let go of who he thought he should be and accept who he actually was. Someone who needed help. Someone who was struggling. Someone who was trying to find his way back to a life that made sense. As they prepared to leave that evening, Thomas walked them to the door of the storage unit. Before they could say goodbye, he reached into one of his plastic bins and pulled out 2 books. He handed one to Marcus and one to Danny. "I want you to have these," Thomas said. "They helped me when I was where you are now." Marcus looked at the book in his hands. It was worn and dog-eared, the pages yellowed with age. Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Danny's book was The Road by Cormac McCarthy. Marcus opened his mouth to protest that they couldn't take Thomas's books, but the older man held up a hand. "Books are meant to be shared. They don't help anyone sitting on a shelf. Read them. When you're done, pass them on to someone else who needs them. That's how we keep the good things moving through the world." Marcus clutched the book to his chest, feeling emotion well up in his throat. It was just a book, he told himself. But it wasn't just a book. It was Thomas trusting them, believing they would read it, believing they were the kind of people who valued literature and ideas and growth. After months of being dismissed and overlooked and treated like they didn't matter, here was someone treating them like they were worth investing in. "Thank you," Marcus managed to say, "for everything, not just the book." Thomas smiled. "Come back next week. Tell me what you think of Frankl. We'll have a discussion, like the old days when I taught." That night, in the truck under the harsh lights of the Walmart parking lot, Marcus opened the book and began to read. He hadn't read anything besides job listings and eviction notices in months, and at first the words felt strange, formal, difficult. But he pushed through, and soon he was absorbed in Frankel's story of surviving Nazi concentration camps, of finding meaning in the most horrific circumstances imaginable, of discovering that the last human freedom is choosing one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. Marcus read until his eyes burned and the words blurred on the page. Then he carefully marked his place and set the book on the dashboard. Beside him, Danny was already asleep, clutching his own book like a child with a teddy bear. Marcus looked at his younger brother and felt a fierce protective love, a determination to make sure Danny got the chance he deserved. Danny was smart, talented, full of potential. He shouldn't be sleeping in a truck because his older brother had failed to keep them afloat. But even as Marcus thought this, he heard Thomas's voice in his head, gentle and insistent. They had saved each other, Thomas had said. Nobody gets through this life alone. Maybe it wasn't about Marcus saving Danny or Danny saving Marcus. Maybe it was about them moving forward together, supporting each other, refusing to let each other fall too far. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern. Wake before dawn, drive to the day labor agency, work 10 or 12 hours at whatever job Gloria assigned them, collect their cash, save most of it. They ate cheap food and slept in the truck and counted every dollar, watching their savings grow with a miserly satisfaction. On Sundays, they visited Thomas, bringing food to share and talking about the books he lent them, about philosophy and literature and the big questions of existence. Through Thomas, Marcus began to see his own situation differently. He had been so focused on what he had lost, the job and the wife and the home and the respect. But Frankel's book taught him that suffering was inevitable, but misery was optional, that he could choose how to respond to his circumstances, even when he couldn't choose the circumstances themselves. It was a revelation that shifted something fundamental in Marcus's understanding of himself and his life. The distribution center became a second home of sorts. Marcus learned the rhythms of the warehouse, the unspoken hierarchies among the workers, the best strategies for moving heavy loads without injuring his back. He made friends with some of the other workers, men like himself who had fallen on hard times and were clawing their way back. There was Carlos, a former restaurant manager whose business had failed during the pandemic. Miguel, an electrician who had lost his license after a DUI. Jerome, a veteran struggling with PTSD who found the structured routine of warehouse work helped him manage his symptoms. They ate lunch together in the break room, sharing stories and strategies for survival. Carlos taught Marcus how to stretch his food budget by shopping at ethnic grocery stores where prices were lower. Miguel knew which mechanics in town would work on vehicles for cash under the table. Jerome shared information about veterans' services that sometimes help non-veterans too, free health clinics and job training programs. It was its own kind of education, this network of people helping each other navigate poverty and rebuilding. Danny was finding his own community at the community college. His business professor, Dr. Sarah Kim, had taken an interest in him after he wrote a compelling essay about economic hardship and resilience. She started meeting with him during office hours, helping him plan his academic path, writing recommendation letters for scholarships. She connected him with other students who were working full-time while pursuing degrees, creating a study group that met at the college library on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. One Thursday in early December, Danny came home later than usual, his face flushed with excitement. Marcus was reading Frankel's book for the second time, making notes in the margins the way Thomas had taught him. He looked up when Danny burst through the door of their small room. "I got it," Danny said breathlessly. "The scholarship. Full tuition for next semester, plus a stipend for books." Marcus set down the book and stood up, pulling his brother into a tight hug. "That's incredible. I'm so proud of you." "Dr. Kim helped me with the application. And get this, she wants me to apply for a student assistant position in the business department. It pays $12 an hour, and I could do it around my class schedule. If I get it, I could cut back on the distribution center hours, focus more on school." Marcus felt a surge of joy mixed with a strange sadness. It was wonderful that Danny was moving forward, finding opportunities, building a future. But it also meant that soon Danny wouldn't need him anymore, would be able to make it on his own. Which was the whole point, Marcus reminded himself. He wanted Danny to succeed, to escape the trap of poverty they had fallen into, even if it meant their lives diverging again. That weekend, they shared Danny's news with Thomas. The older man's reaction was everything Marcus hoped it would be. Thomas grabbed Danny's hands and shook them enthusiastically, his eyes bright with genuine pleasure. "This is wonderful news, truly wonderful. You're going to do remarkable things, Danny. I can see it. You have the intelligence and the drive, but more importantly, you have compassion. You've learned empathy through hardship. That will make you a better businessman than all the theory in the world." Danny ducked his head, embarrassed by the praise, but clearly pleased. "I couldn't have done it without you two. You both kept me going when I wanted to quit." Thomas shook his head. "No, you did this yourself. We just reminded you of what you already had inside you. That's what good teachers do. We don't give people strength. We help them recognize the strength they already possess. They celebrated with pizza again, a tradition that had developed over their Sunday visits. Thomas always insisted on contributing, pulling crumpled bills from his pocket that Marcus knew he could barely afford to spare. But Thomas was firm about it. Dignity, he explained, came from giving as well as receiving, from being part of the exchange instead of just a recipient of charity. As they ate, Thomas told them more stories from his teaching days at Reed, about brilliant students who had gone on to publish novels and poetry collections, about the terrible students who had somehow become his favorites because they worked so hard despite their limitations, about faculty politics and academic conferences and the strange insular world of higher education. But he also talked about the loneliness of that life, the way success had isolated him in some ways, how he had been respected but not necessarily known, how his colleagues had admired his scholarship but hadn't really seen him as a human being with fears and weaknesses. When I lost Catherine, Thomas said quietly, most of my colleagues didn't know how to handle it. They sent cards and flowers, attended the funeral, said the appropriate things. But then they expected me to bounce back, to return to normal. They couldn't understand that there was no normal anymore, that grief had changed me fundamentally. Some of them actually seemed annoyed that I was still sad months later, like I was being self-indulgent by not getting over it quickly enough. Marcus thought about his own losses, his own experience of people's compassion fatigue, how his friends from the lumber mill had been supportive at first when he lost his job, offering to help him find work, inviting him to barbecues and game nights. But as months passed and Marcus's situation didn't improve, the invitations had stopped coming. People got tired of hearing about his problems, got uncomfortable with his continued struggling. Eventually, they just stopped calling. It's easier for people to help when they think the help will be temporary, Marcus said, when they can fix the problem and move on. But when the struggle goes on, when there's no quick solution, people get overwhelmed. They disappear. Thomas nodded. Exactly, and I don't blame them, really. It's hard to watch someone suffer, especially when you can't fix it. But it does teach you something about friendship, about who really shows up in the hard times. My sons showed up eventually, though it took them a while to work through their own anger at me for falling apart. A few people from my AA meetings showed up. But most of my old life, my professional circle, my social network, they all faded away. Who stayed? Danny asked. Thomas smiled. You boys did. When you had every reason to run, you stayed. You came back week after week. You treated me with respect when the world had decided I was worthless. That's a gift I can never fully repay. The conversation grew deeper as the evening progressed. They talked about shame and dignity, about the difference between failing and being a failure. Thomas shared insights from his years on the streets, observations about human nature that could only come from the perspective of invisibility. He talked about the businessmen who stepped over homeless people without a glance, and the working-class mothers who always stopped to offer a few dollars, about the teenagers who sometimes threw things or shouted insults, and the elderly veterans who always paused to talk, recognizing a fellow survivor. You learn that kindness isn't about having resources, Thomas said. Some of the most generous people I met on the streets had almost nothing themselves. They shared food, information, survival strategies. Meanwhile, wealthy people would walk by in expensive suits and pretend I didn't exist. It taught me that character isn't about what you have. It's about what you do with what you have and how you treat people who can't do anything for you. Marcus absorbed these lessons like a student taking notes. Everything Thomas said seemed to carry weight, to connect to some deeper truth about how the world worked. He started applying these principles in his own life, at the distribution center and in his interactions with strangers. When he saw homeless people on his bus route, he stopped pretending they were invisible, started making eye contact, acknowledging their humanity even if he couldn't offer financial help. It was a small thing, but it mattered. One freezing morning in mid-December, Marcus arrived at the distribution center to find Ray looking worried. The overnight supervisor had quit without notice, leaving them short-staffed during the busiest shipping season of the year. Ray pulled Marcus aside during the morning break. I need someone I can trust to cover some overnight shifts. It's temporary, just through the holidays, but it pays time and a half. You interested? Marcus thought about it. Overnight shifts would be brutal, especially on top of his regular day shifts. He would barely sleep, but the extra money would be significant. Could accelerate their savings, get them out of the truck and into a real apartment sooner, make it possible to have his daughter visit without being ashamed of where he lived. I'll do it, Marcus said. Whatever you need. Ray clapped him on the shoulder. I knew I could count on you. Start tonight, midnight to 8 a.m. And Marcus? This is the kind of thing management notices, the kind of thing that helps when promotion decisions are being made. For the next 3 weeks, Marcus barely slept. He worked his regular shift from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., caught a few hours of sleep in the truck, then returned for the overnight shift from midnight to 8 a.m. His body screamed in protest. His eyes burned with exhaustion. But he showed up every night, did the work, never complained. Danny covered for him when he could, bringing him food and coffee, making sure he didn't oversleep between shifts. The other workers noticed. Jerome started bringing Marcus extra sandwiches from home. Carlos saved him a spot in the break room where Marcus could nap during lunch. Even the other supervisors, who normally kept their distance from the warehouse workers, started acknowledging Marcus with nods and brief conversations. He was proving himself in the way that mattered most in this world. Through consistent, reliable hard work. On Christmas Eve, Ray called Marcus into the office. Marcus's heart sank. Christmas Eve summons usually meant bad news. Layoffs were common during the slow period after the holiday rush. But Ray was smiling when Marcus entered. Johnson is retiring earlier than planned. Health issues. Management wants me to recommend someone for the team lead position. I'm recommending you. 15% raise, benefits package, and you'd be supervising your own crew. What do you say? Marcus felt emotion well up in his throat. After months of struggling, of sleeping in his truck, of wondering if he would ever have a real life again, here was proof that the climb back was possible. That hard work and consistency mattered. That he was building something real. I say yes. Absolutely yes. Thank you, Ray. Thank you for believing in me. Ray shook his hand. You earned it, Marcus. Now go home and get some sleep. You look like death warmed over. Marcus drove back to the Walmart parking lot in a daze. It was only 4 p.m., still light out, and the parking lot was packed with last-minute Christmas shoppers. He sat in the truck for a long time, watching families load gifts into their cars, thinking about where he had been a year ago and where he was now. The contrast was staggering. Last Christmas he had been separated from his wife, estranged from his daughter, unemployed and hopeless. This Christmas, he had a job with a promotion coming, a brother who was thriving in school, and a friend in Thomas who had changed his entire perspective on life. When Danny returned from his classes that evening, Marcus told him the news. They celebrated quietly, aware that they were still living in a truck in a Walmart parking lot despite the good news. But the trajectory was clear now. They were moving in the right direction, building something sustainable, creating a future that made sense. I think we should try to find a place in January, Marcus said. A real apartment. We've saved enough now, especially with my raise coming. It's time to stop living like this. Danny nodded enthusiastically. I've been looking at listings. There's a complex near the college that has studios for $800 a month. If we split it, that's $400 each. We can afford that now. They spent Christmas Day with Thomas, the three of them creating their own makeshift holiday in the storage unit. Thomas had decorated minimally, a small artificial tree purchased from a thrift store, a string of battery-powered lights. They exchanged small gifts. Thomas gave them each a book, carefully selected from his collection. Marcus and Danny had pooled their money to buy Thomas a warm winter coat, noticing how thin his current one was. When Thomas opened it, his eyes filled with tears. This is too much, he protested. You boys need your money. We need you to be warm, Danny said firmly. That's more important than money. They ate canned soup, heated on Thomas's camping stove, and talked until late into the night. Thomas told them stories about Christmases past, about his sons opening presents as children, about Catherine's famous Christmas cookies that his colleagues at Reed used to wait for all year. There was sadness in his voice, but also gratitude for the memories, acceptance of what had been lost, and appreciation for what remained. True to Thomas's advice, they went to the day labor agency that morning. The work was hard, loading trucks at a distribution center, but they got paid in cash at the end of the shift. They went back the next day and the day after that. After a week, the supervisor offered them regular positions. After a month, they had saved enough to rent a small room in the house Thomas had mentioned. It had 2 beds, a hot plate, a shared bathroom down the hall. To Marcus, it felt like a palace. The house was in a neighborhood Marcus would have avoided just months earlier. The paint was peeling, the yard was overgrown, and the other tenants were a mix of day laborers, recovering addicts, and people on disability. But the landlord, a Vietnamese immigrant named Mr. Nguyen, asked no questions and accepted cash. He showed them the room with its 2 twin beds, a small closet, and a window that looked out onto the street. The mattresses were thin, the walls were stained, but it had a door that locked and a roof that didn't leak. This good for you? Mr. Nguyen asked in heavily accented English. Marcus looked around the cramped space, and then at Danny, who was already smiling. It's perfect, Marcus said. We'll take it. They moved in that afternoon, which didn't take long since they owned almost nothing. 2 duffel bags of clothes, a few toiletries, the books Thomas had given them. But the act of unpacking, of putting their things in the closet and making up the beds with sheets they bought at a thrift store, felt monumental. They had an address again, a place to receive mail. A place to tell people when they asked where they lived. That first night in the room, Marcus lay in bed listening to the sounds of the house. Someone's television playing too loud downstairs. A couple arguing in Spanish in the next room. Cars passing on the street outside. Normal sounds. Human sounds. The sounds of being part of the world again instead of camping on its edges. He thought about calling his ex-wife, telling her about the room, about the job, about how he was getting back on his feet, but it was too soon. He needed more to show her, needed to prove this wasn't just a temporary upswing before another crash. In the morning, Marcus and Danny caught the bus to work. Another new routine, another small marker of progress. The distribution center had hired them on permanently after seeing their work ethic during those first weeks of day labor. The pay was still modest, but it came with benefits now. Health insurance, paid sick days, the possibility of raises and promotions. Marcus worked harder than he ever had at the lumber mill, determined to prove he deserved this chance. His supervisor, a man named Ray, who had worked at the distribution center for 15 years, noticed. Ray started giving Marcus more responsibility, teaching him how to operate the forklifts, showing him how to organize the loading schedules for maximum efficiency. One afternoon, about 2 months after they started, Ray pulled Marcus aside during a break. "You're good at this work," Ray said, sipping coffee from a battered thermos. "Better than most. You think about moving up? We're going to need a new team lead in a few months when Johnson retires." Marcus felt hope surge in his chest. A team lead position would mean more money, more stability, more proof that he was rebuilding his life. "I'd be interested in that. Very interested." Ray nodded. "Keep doing what you're doing. Show up on time, work hard, don't cause drama. I'll put in a word for you with management." Marcus went back to work with renewed energy. For the first time in over a year, he could see a path forward. Not just survival, but actual progress. The possibility of a career again, not just a job. The money to maybe rent a real apartment. The stability to rebuild his relationship with his daughter. He told Thomas about it that Sunday. They were sitting in the storage unit eating sandwiches Marcus had brought from a deli near the distribution center. Thomas listened with his characteristic intensity, nodding thoughtfully as Marcus described the conversation with Ray. "That's wonderful news," Thomas said. "But remember, the external changes are important, but the internal changes matter more. You're not just getting a promotion. You're becoming someone who deserves a promotion. Someone who shows up, who works hard, who takes responsibility. That's who you are now. Don't forget that when things get difficult." Marcus understood what Thomas meant. The old Marcus, the one who had fallen apart after losing his mill job, would have found excuses, would have blamed others, would have given up when things got hard. The new Marcus, the one emerging from these months of struggle, was different, stronger, more resilient. The hardship had burned away something weak inside him and revealed something tougher underneath. Danny was changing too. He had enrolled in night classes at Portland Community College, using some of his savings to pay for 2 courses, business administration and accounting. He studied on the bus rides to and from work, his textbooks balanced on his knees, completely absorbed. Marcus watched his younger brother transform from a directionless kid into a focused young man with goals and plans. It filled him with pride, and also with regret for the years Danny had lost helping Marcus survive instead of building his own life. One night, as they sat in their small room eating ramen noodles and studying, Marcus brought it up. "I'm sorry I dragged you down with me. You should have gone on to university, should have built your own life instead of trying to save mine." Danny looked up from his textbook, surprised. "You didn't drag me down. I chose to help you. You're my brother. Besides, maybe I needed this too. Needed to struggle to learn what I'm made of. I was drifting before, going to community college because everyone said I should, not because I wanted to. Now I know what I want. I want to finish my degree. I want to work in business, maybe start my own company someday. I wouldn't know that if everything had been easy." Marcus nodded, feeling emotion tighten his throat. "When did you get so wise?" Danny grinned. "I learned from the best, you and Thomas." The mention of Thomas reminded Marcus that they hadn't seen him in 2 weeks. Work had been especially busy, with mandatory overtime, and by the time Sunday rolled around, they were too exhausted to do anything but sleep. Marcus made a mental note to visit the storage unit the following weekend, no matter how tired they were. Thomas had been their lifeline when they needed it most. They owed him more than occasional visits. But when they arrived at the storage facility the next Sunday, Unit 217 was empty. The door was rolled up, and inside there was nothing but bare concrete and dust. For a terrible moment, Marcus thought something had happened to Thomas. Had he been evicted? Had he gotten sick? Had he relapsed and disappeared back into the chaos of active addiction? They found the facility manager in the office, a bored-looking woman in her 20s, scrolling through her phone. She looked up with obvious irritation when they knocked on her door. "Can I help you?" "Unit 217, Marcus said urgently. "The man who rented it, Thomas Reeves. Do you know what happened to him?" The manager checked her computer, clicking through screens. Reeves. Yeah, he terminated his lease 2 weeks ago. Cleared everything out, left the unit clean. No forwarding address. Marcus felt panic rising. Did he say where he was going? Did he leave a message? The manager shrugged. I wasn't here when he came in. All I know is what's in the computer. Sorry. They drove through Portland for hours that afternoon, checking the places they knew Thomas frequented. The bookstore where he worked, the church where he attended meetings, the public library downtown where he sometimes spent afternoons. No one had seen him in days. Marcus tried not to imagine the worst, but his mind kept going there anyway. Thomas relapsing, Thomas giving up. Thomas disappearing back into the streets. Finally, desperate, Marcus called the bookstore again and asked to speak to the manager. After explaining who he was and why he was looking for Thomas, the manager's voice softened. Oh, Thomas. Yes, he doesn't work here anymore, but it's good news. He got a position at Reed College, in their library. He was so excited about it. Started about a week and a half ago. Marcus felt relief flood through him so intensely it made him dizzy. Thomas hadn't relapsed. He had moved up, had found something better. The thought filled Marcus with joy, but also with a strange sadness. Their Sunday visits in the storage unit had become precious to him. The thought of not having that steady connection to Thomas felt like losing something important. But Danny pointed out the obvious. We can still see him. We just need to find out how to reach him. Reed's not that far away. They found Thomas 3 days later, during his lunch break at Reed College. He was sitting on a bench outside the library, eating a sandwich and reading a book, looking more at peace than Marcus had ever seen him. When he spotted them approaching, his face broke into that transforming smile. Boys, I've been hoping you'd find me. I should have left word at the facility, but everything happened so fast. Thomas told them the whole story as they sat on the bench together. About the professor who had heard about him through Danny, about the interview at Reed, about the job offer with its modest but livable salary and housing assistance, about how terrified he had been to accept, to step back into the world of academia after so many years away. About how the first week had been overwhelming but also wonderful, being surrounded by books and students and the intellectual energy he had missed so desperately. And here's the real news, Thomas said, his eyes shining. I have an apartment, a real apartment on campus. 1 room, kitchenette, private bathroom. It's small, but it's mine. And I want you boys to come see it, help me celebrate. The apartment was in a building reserved for college staff, a modest complex near the edge of campus. Thomas's unit was on the 3rd floor, exactly as he had described it. 1 room that served as bedroom and living room, a tiny kitchenette, a bathroom barely big enough to turn around in. But after the storage unit, it must have felt like a mansion. Thomas had moved his few possessions in, and Marcus recognized the familiar items from the storage unit. The folding chair, now set up by the window. The plastic bins, now serving as makeshift furniture. The books, now arranged on a small shelf. What do you think? Thomas asked, watching their faces anxiously. It's perfect, Marcus said honestly. I'm so happy for you, Thomas. You deserve this. You really do. They celebrated with pizza and soda, sitting on the floor of Thomas's apartment and talking late into the evening. Thomas told them about his work at the library, about the students who came in looking for help with research, about the quiet satisfaction of shelving books and maintaining order in the stacks. Marcus and Danny told Thomas about their own progress, about Marcus's potential promotion, about Danny's classes, about the small room in Mr. Nguyen's house that had become their temporary home. As the evening wore on and the conversation moved from practical matters to deeper subjects, Thomas grew more serious. There's something I want to tell you both, something I've been thinking about a lot since I started this new job. Marcus and Danny waited, sensing the importance of whatever Thomas was about to say. That night you broke into my storage unit, Thomas began. I was planning to end my life. The words hung in the air like smoke. Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. Danny's eyes went wide. I had it all planned out, Thomas continued quietly. I had saved up pills from various sources over the months. I was going to take them that night, just go to sleep and not wake up. I was tired. So tired of struggling, of being invisible, of feeling like I had nothing left to offer the world. I had made my peace with it, and then you boys showed up and everything changed. Thomas looked at them with such intensity that Marcus had to fight the urge to look away. You saved my life that night. You gave me a reason to keep going. Suddenly, I had people who needed me, who came to visit, who cared about what I had to say. You made me feel like I mattered again, like my story wasn't over yet. I need you to know that. I need you to understand that you didn't just receive help that night. You gave it too. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face before he even realized he was crying. All this time he had thought they were the ones being saved, the ones receiving grace and wisdom from this remarkable man. He hadn't realized that the salvation went both ways, that in the act of accepting Thomas's help, they had helped him too. that their Sunday visits, their questions about books and philosophy, their genuine interest in Thomas's thoughts and experiences had been giving him a reason to stay alive. Danny was crying too, his young face crumpling with emotion. We didn't know. We had no idea you were feeling that way. How could you? Thomas said gently. I was good at hiding it, good at pretending everything was okay. But that night, when I saw you standing there in the doorway, I made a choice. I chose to live. I chose to invite you in instead of sending you away. And that choice led to everything that's happened since. The sobriety meetings where I got stronger, the bookstore job, the reconnection with my sons. And now this new beginning at Reed. All of it traces back to that November night when you boys broke into my storage unit. The three of them sat in silence for a long time after that, each processing the weight of Thomas's revelation. Marcus thought about all the moments when things could have gone differently, if they had chosen a different storage unit, if Thomas had called the police, if they had run instead of staying, if Thomas had sent them away instead of inviting them in. Any of those choices would have led to a completely different outcome. Thomas might have died. Marcus and Danny might have ended up in jail or deeper into crime. Instead, they had found each other at exactly the right moment, and 3 lives had been transformed. But the real change was internal. Meeting Thomas had shifted something fundamental in how Marcus saw himself in his situation. He wasn't just a victim of circumstances anymore, wasn't just drifting through bad luck. He was a person making choices, and his choices mattered. He started going to the free job training at the community center, learning skills that might lead to better work. Danny enrolled in night classes at the community college, determined to finish his degree. They visited Thomas every Sunday. At first, they brought food, supplies, things they thought he might need, but Thomas always insisted on sharing whatever they brought, making a small feast on his camping stove, treating the storage unit like a dining room and them like honored guests. Over time, the visits became less about helping Thomas and more about learning from him. He introduced them to books he loved, shared stories from his teaching days, talked about literature and philosophy and the big questions of life. In that small space, surrounded by plastic bins and camping gear, Marcus received an education money couldn't buy. Winter deepened. Portland's famous rain turned the city gray and cold, but Marcus and Danny kept working, kept saving, kept visiting Thomas on Sundays. In January, Marcus got a call from his ex-wife. Their daughter wanted to visit for spring break. The call lasted 3 minutes, but when Marcus hung up, he stood in the small room he shared with Danny and cried for the first time since everything had fallen apart. Not tears of sadness, but of hope. His life wasn't fixed, wasn't perfect, but it was moving in the right direction again. In February, something remarkable happened. Danny had been talking about Thomas with one of his professors at the community college, describing the former Reed College professor living in a storage unit. The professor knew someone who knew someone, and word got back to the administration at Reed. They reached out to Thomas through the bookstore where he worked. They wanted to offer him a position, not teaching, but working in the library. It came with benefits, including housing assistance. Thomas almost said no. The storage unit had become comfortable in its own way. It was safe, contained under his control. The idea of re-entering the world, of having colleagues and responsibilities and expectations, terrified him. But Marcus and Danny convinced him to at least meet with the people from Reed. They went with him, the 3 of them sitting in a conference room that Thomas remembered from his previous life, supporting him as he negotiated his return. He started in March, on the anniversary of Catherine's death. It felt significant, like closing one chapter and opening another. The job was quiet work, shelving books and helping students with research. Not teaching, but still connected to the world of learning he had loved. The pay was modest, but enough. Reed helped him find a studio apartment near campus. For the first time in 5 years, Thomas had a real home. The storage unit remained rented for a few more months. Thomas couldn't quite bring himself to give it up completely. It had saved his life in its own way. But eventually, with Marcus and Danny's help, he packed up his belongings, donated most of them, and moved everything else into his new apartment. They kept a few items from the storage unit as mementos. Thomas kept his camping stove and folding chair. Marcus kept one of the paper cups they had drunk terrible coffee from on that cold November night. By the time summer arrived, all 3 lives looked different. Marcus had been promoted to supervisor at the distribution center. He was seeing his daughter regularly, rebuilding that relationship, one awkward conversation at a time. Danny had made the dean's list and was thinking about transferring to a 4-year university. Thomas had a small circle of friends again, people from work and from his church meetings. He was writing again too, not academic papers, but a memoir about his years on the streets, about loss and redemption, and the unexpected places we find grace. They still met every Sunday, though now it was at Thomas's apartment or at a diner they all liked. They talked about books and work and life. They laughed more than Marcus could remember laughing in years. They had become, in the way that sometimes happens when people meet at the right moment, a family of choice. Bound not by blood, but by a shared experience, by the memory of a November night when 3 lives intersected in the most unlikely way. One Sunday in late September, almost a year after their first meeting, they were sitting in Thomas's apartment when Marcus brought up something that had been on his mind. He had never really apologized, not properly, for breaking into the storage unit that night. Every time he tried, Thomas would wave it away, insist it all worked out for the best. But Marcus needed to say it, needed Thomas to hear it. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "What we did that night, planning to rob you, it was wrong. We were desperate, but that doesn't excuse it. You could have had us arrested. You should have. Instead, you helped us. You changed our lives. And I need you to know how sorry I am and how grateful." Thomas was quiet for a moment, looking at these 2 young men who had become so important to him. Then he smiled that transforming smile, the one that made him look decades younger. "You want to know the truth?" Thomas said. "That night you broke into my storage unit was one of the best nights of my life. I had been feeling sorry for myself, wondering if I mattered, if my story was over. Then you 2 showed up, and suddenly I had a purpose again. I could help. I could make a difference. You gave me that gift, whether you meant to or not. So maybe we're even." But Danny shook his head. "We're not even. We'll never be even. You saved us, Thomas. You really did." Thomas reached over and put a hand on Danny's shoulder. "We saved each other. That's how it works when you do it right. Nobody gets through this life alone. We all need help sometimes. The trick is being brave enough to accept it, and then being generous enough to offer it when it's your turn." Outside, the late summer sun was setting over Portland, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Inside, 3 men who had found each other in the darkest moment shared a meal and a companionship that had become essential to each of them. The coffee was still terrible, they all agreed, but Thomas made it anyway because it reminded them of where they had started, of how far they had come. They visited Thomas every Sunday. At first, they brought food, supplies, things they thought he might need, but Thomas always insisted on sharing whatever they brought, making a small feast on his camping stove, treating the storage unit like a dining room and them like honored guests. Over time, the visits became less about helping Thomas and more about learning from him. He introduced them to books he loved, shared stories from his teaching days, talked about literature and philosophy and the big questions of life. In that small space, surrounded by plastic bins and camping gear, Marcus received an education money couldn't buy. Winter deepened. Portland's famous rain turned the city gray and cold, but Marcus and Danny kept working, kept saving, kept visiting Thomas on Sundays. In January, Marcus got a call from his ex-wife. Their daughter wanted to visit for spring break. The call lasted 3 minutes, but when Marcus hung up, he stood in the small room he shared with Danny and cried for the first time since everything had fallen apart. Not tears of sadness, but of hope. His life wasn't fixed, wasn't perfect, but it was moving in the right direction again. In February, something remarkable happened. Danny had been talking about Thomas with one of his professors at the community college, describing the former Reed College professor living in a storage unit. The professor knew someone who knew someone, and word got back to the administration at Reed. They reached out to Thomas through the bookstore where he worked. They wanted to offer him a position, not teaching, but working in the library. It came with benefits, including housing assistance. Thomas almost said no. The storage unit had become comfortable in its own way. It was safe, contained under his control. The idea of re-entering the world, of having colleagues and responsibilities and expectations, terrified him. But Marcus and Danny convinced him to at least meet with the people from Reed. They went with him, the 3 of them sitting in a conference room that Thomas remembered from his previous life, supporting him as he negotiated his return. He started in March, on the anniversary of Catherine's death. It felt significant, like closing one chapter and opening another. The job was quiet work, shelving books and helping students with research. Not teaching, but still connected to the world of learning he had loved. The pay was modest, but enough. Reed helped him find a studio apartment near campus. For the first time in 5 years, Thomas had a real home. The storage unit remained rented for a few more months. Thomas couldn't quite bring himself to give it up completely. It had saved his life in its own way. But eventually, with Marcus and Danny's help, he packed up his belongings, donated most of them, and moved everything else into his new apartment. They kept a few items from the storage unit as mementos. Thomas kept his camping stove and folding chair. Marcus kept one of the paper cups they had drunk terrible coffee from on that cold November night. By the time summer arrived, all 3 lives looked different. Marcus had been promoted to supervisor at the distribution center. He was seeing his daughter regularly, rebuilding that relationship, one awkward conversation at a time. Danny had made the dean's list and was thinking about transferring to a 4-year university. Thomas had a small circle of friends again, people from work and from his church meetings. He was writing again, too, not academic papers, but a memoir about his years on the streets, about loss and redemption, and the unexpected places we find grace. They still met every Sunday, though now it was at Thomas's apartment or at a diner they all liked. They talked about books and work and life. They laughed more than Marcus could remember laughing in years. They had become, in the way that sometimes happens when people meet at the right moment, a family of choice. Bound not by blood, but by a shared experience, by the memory of a November night when 3 lives intersected in the most unlikely way. One Sunday in late September, almost a year after their first meeting, they were sitting in Thomas's apartment when Marcus brought up something that had been on his mind. He had never really apologized, not properly, for breaking into the storage unit that night. Every time he tried, Thomas would wave it away, insist it all worked out for the best. But Marcus needed to say it, needed Thomas to hear it. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "What we did that night, planning to rob you, it was wrong. We were desperate, but that doesn't excuse it. You could have had us arrested. You should have. Instead, you helped us. You changed our lives. And I need you to know how sorry I am and how grateful." Thomas was quiet for a moment, looking at these 2 young men who had become so important to him. Then he smiled that transforming smile, the one that made him look decades younger. "You want to know the truth?" Thomas said. "That night you broke into my storage unit was one of the best nights of my life. I had been feeling sorry for myself, wondering if I mattered, if my story was over. Then you 2 showed up, and suddenly I had a purpose again. I could help. I could make a difference. You gave me that gift, whether you meant to or not. So maybe we're even." But Danny shook his head. "We're not even. We'll never be even. You saved us, Thomas. You really did." Thomas reached over and put a hand on Danny's shoulder. "We saved each other. That's how it works when you do it right. Nobody gets through this life alone. We all need help sometimes. The trick is being brave enough to accept it, and then being generous enough to offer it when it's your turn." Outside, the late summer sun was setting over Portland, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Inside, 3 men who had found each other in the darkest moment shared a meal and a companionship that had become essential to each of them. The coffee was still terrible, they all agreed, but Thomas made it anyway because it reminded them of where they had started, of how far they had come. Marcus thought about the person he had been that cold November night, desperate, angry, willing to steal from strangers to survive. He thought about the moment when the storage unit door rolled up and revealed not empty space, but a human life. How that moment could have gone so many different ways. How lucky they were that Thomas was the kind of man who invited them in instead of turning them away. How a single choice, a single act of compassion could ripple outward and change everything. He thought about the other storage units they might have broken into if things had gone differently that night, the path they were on, the people they were becoming, and he felt a profound gratitude, not just for Thomas, but for the universe or fate or whatever force had put them together at exactly the right moment. As the evening deepened and they moved on to easier topics, Marcus caught Danny's eye across the small living room. His brother smiled at him, and Marcus saw in that smile the kid Danny had been before hardship tried to harden him, saw the man he was becoming now, full of potential and hope. And Marcus thought about his own daughter, about the chance he had to be the father she deserved. About second chances and new beginnings and the strange ways we find salvation. Later, as they were leaving, Thomas walked them to the door. He had aged in reverse over the past year, Marcus realized. Filled out a bit, the gauntness gone from his face. His eyes were clearer, his bearing more confident. He looked like someone who had found his place in the world again, or maybe had created a new place entirely. "Same time next week?" Thomas asked. "Same time next week," Marcus confirmed. They hugged goodbye, these 3 men from different generations and different circumstances, bound together by a moment of unexpected grace. As Marcus and Danny walked to the truck, Marcus turned back one last time to see Thomas standing in the doorway of his apartment, waving. And Marcus realized that this simple scene of friendship and connection, was what they had been stealing for all those months. Not furniture or tools or forgotten belongings, but this, the feeling of belonging, the knowledge that someone cared, the basic human need to matter to someone else. They had tried to take it by force, breaking into spaces that weren't theirs, but Thomas had given it freely, opening his door and his heart to 2 strangers who meant him harm. In doing so, he had shown them a different way to live, a better way, one built on compassion and generosity instead of desperation and taking. The drive back to their apartment was quiet. The Portland streets were busy with Saturday night crowds, people heading to restaurants and bars and shows. Marcus and Danny were part of the city again, part of the flow of normal life. Not invisible anymore, not lost. They had been found by a man living in a storage unit, and in finding them, he had found himself too. When they reached their apartment, Danny paused before getting out of the truck. You ever think about what would have happened if we'd chosen a different unit that night? All the time, Marcus admitted. We could be in jail right now, or we could still be out there, getting deeper into that life. Instead, we got Thomas. Best luck we ever had, Danny said. Marcus nodded. Best luck we ever had. They climbed the stairs to their small apartment, exhausted from a long week of work and grateful for a place to rest. Inside, Danny started making dinner while Marcus called his daughter. She answered on the third ring, and just the sound of her voice saying Dad made his chest tight with emotion. They talked about her week at school, about plans for her next visit, normal things. Beautiful, ordinary, normal things. After the call, Marcus stood at the window looking out at the city lights. He thought about all the people out there living in storage units and cars on the streets, people who had fallen through the cracks, who had lost everything, who had become invisible. He thought about how easy it was to become one of them, how thin the line was between having a life and losing it. And he thought about Thomas, who had been on both sides of that line and had learned to see beauty in both places. There was a lesson in all of it, Marcus knew, something about how we're all just one catastrophe away from losing everything, but we're also all just one act of kindness away from finding our way back, about how the people we dismiss as less than us might be the very people who save us. About how breaking into someone's home can lead to the most important friendship of your life if you're open to the possibility. He turned away from the window to help Danny with dinner. As they ate together, talking about plans for the week ahead, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in years. Contentment, not happiness exactly, not yet. Life was still hard, money was still tight, the future was still uncertain. But he had his brother, he had Thomas, he had his daughter coming back into his life. He had work and a roof over his head and hope for tomorrow. And he had the memory of a November night when everything could have gone wrong but went right instead. The Scavengers had broken into a homeless man's storage unit, not knowing who was inside. They had found a professor, a friend, a teacher, a father figure. They had found someone who saw past their worst moment to the people they could become. And in the process, they had found themselves. Years from now, Marcus knew he would tell this story to his grandchildren. About the time he hit rock bottom and found treasure there. About the professor who lived in Unit 217 and taught him that compassion costs nothing but changes everything. About the night desperation led him to break down a door and what he found on the other side saved his life. The coffee would always be terrible. They would joke about that forever. But the friendship was real, and the lessons learned were valuable beyond measure. Some people come into our lives through conventional means, through work or school or mutual friends, and some people come into our lives because we break into their storage unit at 3 a.m. on a freezing November night. The how doesn't matter as much as the what comes after. What came after, for Marcus and Danny and Thomas, was transformation, was redemption, was proof that people can change, that second chances exist, that the worst moments of our lives can lead to the best outcomes if we're brave enough to be vulnerable and generous enough to help each other. They had all been broken in different ways, and somehow, together, they had helped each other heal. The story didn't end with everything perfect. Life isn't a fairy tale. Marcus still struggled with regret about the years he lost with his daughter. Danny still worried about money and whether he could finish his degree. Thomas still attended his meetings, still fought the demons that had once nearly destroyed him. But they face these challenges together now, with the strength that comes from knowing someone has your back, with the wisdom that comes from having survived the worst and lived to tell about it. And sometimes, on quiet Sunday afternoons in Thomas's apartment, they would sit together with their terrible coffee and just be grateful. Grateful for a November night that changed everything. Grateful for the courage to stay when everything said to run. Grateful for the kindness that opens doors instead of closing them. Grateful for second chances and new beginnings and the strange, beautiful ways that broken people can help each other become whole. The story of the Scavengers who broke into a homeless man's storage unit became a story of transformation and hope. It became proof that our worst decisions don't have to define us, that who we are in our darkest moments isn't who we have to remain. That sometimes, when we think we're taking from others, we're actually receiving the greatest gift imaginable. The gift of being seen, being heard, being believed in. The gift of another chance. And that chance, that precious opportunity to start again, to choose differently, to become better than we were, is the real treasure we're all looking for. It isn't hidden in storage units or waiting in some external place. It's in us, in our capacity to forgive ourselves and others, to extend grace when judgment would be easier, to see past the surface to the struggling human beneath. Marcus, Danny, and Thomas had all been that struggling human at different times. They had all needed someone to see past their failures to their potential, and when they finally found each other in that unlikely place at that unlikely moment, They gave each other exactly what they needed most. Not money or shelter or material goods, though those things mattered too, but something more fundamental. They gave each other hope. And hope, it turned out, was the only thing worth stealing and the only thing that multiplied when you gave it away.